Your YouTube feed is crap. Stop wasting your time watching bot-boosted shills and self-appointed gurus cloying for your attention. Instead, join the Gosslings interview live stream and podcast. The Gosslings, a dark-lit digital speakeasy of free thinkers. A super chat of radical truth-seeking wizards who eat trolls for second breakfast. Topics that'll make your mama's hair stand on end. Ideas that'll make your pastor's knees knock. Guests that will illuminate the hidden chambers of your mind. And interviews that strike down the darkness. Welcome to the Gosslings.
I'm a little ticklish on the inside.
Hey everybody.
Welcome.
Greetings.
I'm Jonathan.
I'm Nick.
And we are the Gosslings. And we have an awesome interview guest for you guys today. Nick, you want to sort of do a little preamble? We can do the toast and then get rolling.
Absolutely.
We're starting a little late today because we had so much fun talking to him.
Yeah, we were chatting with our guest who is waiting live in the background. We're going to bring him on in just a second. Oh yeah, we are super excited about this. We'll do our toast here in just a second. Before I get too far into this, just so I don't forget, because I'm horrible at this. Yeah. Don't forget to subscribe. We love you guys, and we want to continue bringing you amazing guests with great, relevant, yet kind of fringe topics that people keep asking questions about. No one seems to want to talk about it, and we need answers.
A lot of questions that a lot of people don't want to ask, but they scratch at the back of your brain.
Yep.
Well, we are the back scratcher. We just go in there.
We are the back scratchers.
Hit that spot.
That's right. That's right. You can find us, of course. You're probably watching this on YouTube. You can also find us on Rumble and the podcast version on Spotify. And you can buy super sweet T-shirts as well. I'll pull this up here. We can talk about this more later. We got T-shirts.
We designed some new ones last week.
Yes, some alien-themed T-shirts that are amazing.
Yeah, some pretty relevant ones to today's guest also, I think, as well.
I think so.
And then and we're on Instagram, Nick Goss Writes,
at Nick
Realms Novels.
Yep, that's us right here. We'll put this up there. Boom, there we are, at Nick Goss Writes and at Heavenly Realms Novels. Without further ado, let's do our toast.
Yes, on to the toast. Nick, this has been your idea and your baby, so if you want to do the toast,
I would be honored to initiate. Absolutely.
Raise your libations. What are we drinking today, by the way? Is it
this is actually, it's called Tennessee Black and Tan.
Oh yeah,
it's from H. Clark, just down the road.
Oh yeah,
local.
Great.
Yep.
I got an interesting story about that, by the way.
I
went to the opening. Anyway.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Take up the broken sword of your father
and strike down the darkness. Cheers.
Cheers. Oh yeah.
So, okay, before we bring our guest on, real quick. This story. I went to the H. Clark Distillery grand opening in 2015.
Yep.
And there was a former Miss America there. I think I may have mentioned this before. I can't remember.
You get her number?
No, there was a ring.
Never mind.
So I know. Yeah. As much of a mercenary as I may be, when, the ring's there for a reason, that's your cue, boys.
Understood.
Walk away. No, but she was very lovely. She was very smart. I asked her what her pet cause du jour was, because all of those girls, they all have, and it's always like, yeah, save the whales or the puppy dogs, or I want to feed, whatever, the tribes that no one's ever heard of. Yeah. Well, this chick, then this is 2015. So this is before all the stuff that came out, she said sex trafficking.
Ooh.
And I went,
yeah, because back then that was
no one knew about it back then.
Yeah.
Turns out, according to her and her involvement with law enforcement, Nashville is it's a hub.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, because we have 3 major interstates, we have the river, we have the railways.
Oh yeah.
So it was a very illuminating conversation, and as the years progressed and we started to learn more about these secret societies and what these people do and what they have been doing for a long time, and how all this plays into the biblical narrative of these things behind the scenes. It bore out.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah,
so,
very wild. That's why we keep our kids on leashes.
Yeah, that's fair.
They're 12 and 10, but
well, you never know.
They make pretty big leashes these days. So.
Yeah, Child Tracker 5,000. That's a South Park joke. But that's also a good reason to check out this interview, because one of the guests we have today has a great book out. several books, and he's a huge personality in the sort
In
of
this space.
in that space of Christian esoterica and arcane, Christian and conspiracies.
He helps us
and-
understand the past,
Yeah.
so that we can interpret what's coming in the future.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
And extremely relevant. We adore him and his work. It's awesome. Nick, take it.
Let's bring him on. The one and only, the author of The Second Coming of Saturn.
Yeah.
Also a member of if you look up the name Derek Gilbert,
Yeah.
you're gonna find a ton. He's an accomplished author. He and his wife Sharon, they're fantastic, and we have the pleasure of talking with Derek today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the man
doctor
himself
of dissemination.
Derek Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Derek.
Oh, fellas, it's an honor to be here, and what an introduction! Boy, I love that. That was you hit all the right notes.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you much.
You know
Thank
what?
you
Coming
much.
from someone with with a background in broadcasting like you, that actually really helps sort of ease the anxiety of like, oh my gosh, am I screwing this up? How bad am I screwing this up right now? On a scale of 8 to 20.
Well, thank you for taking time. I mean, it's Memorial Day weekend, and you agreed to do this interview, and we got a ton of questions. Of course, we've read your book.
Yeah.
And I would like to, first of all, tell us about how did you come up with The Second Coming of Saturn? What's it about, and what inspired you to write this book?
The book really derives from the research that Sharon and I have been doing for the last 7 years, ever since we moved to the Ozarks and partnered with Skywatch TV.
Yeah.
And God bless Tom Horn for encouraging us in this, because a lot of this stuff is, as you say, kind of fringe or esoteric. But the deeper we dug into the connections between Greek and Roman mythology, or what's called mythology, really their religion, and the Bible, the more overlap we found.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated, and been fascinated with the concept of the Nephilim ever since hearing this preached at a church in my mid-30s. Okay, I'd been a churchgoer since I was a kid. Our parents took us to church every Sunday, but never attended a church where they ever touched on the early chapters of Genesis, other than to say, yes, God created the world in 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. And now let's move on to Abraham.
Right.
Yep. Right.
Yeah. Skip over all that stuff we don't know what to do with.
Right,
Or
exactly.
we're afraid to talk
That's
about.
all weird, and we can't document it through science, so we'll just forget all of that stuff. But in my mid-30s, Sharon and I were, after we had married, attended a small independent Baptist church and heard an evangelist talk about it. And I was like, wow, has this always been in here? I mean, this stuff is. Sharon's like, yeah. Of course, she was raised in a church that taught end times prophecy from the pulpit on a regular basis. I never did. So I went to a library in St. Louis County, found L.A. Marzulli's novel called Nephilim. So I blame Marzulli for all of this. That kind of led into a number of lines of research that led to, finding Chuck Missler and his work on aliens and stuff. But as we got here and had time to devote full time to this, wrote my first book, The Great Inception, which talked about the significance of mountains in the biblical narrative. It seems like all of the really significant supernatural events take place on or around mountains. Mount Sinai, the Mount of Olives, Mount Carmel. There's Mount Hermon, where the Watchers descended and created this giant race of monsters called the Nephilim. But even the mountain where Baal's palace is supposed to be located, which is mentioned in Isaiah 14, although most English translations don't make it obvious. They translate the name of that mountain as the sides of the north, or the heights of the north, or the remote slopes of the north. When you start digging into it, you realize that mountains were really significant, because in the ancient world, it was just understood that's where the gods lived, because they're remote and pristine and far removed from our grubby human hands. And so this is where they live. Well, okay, there's a reason Moses was brought up Mount Sinai and given the law on what was called the mountain of God in the book of Exodus, but the Hebrew could also read mountain of the gods. Again, that's another choice that English translators make, because there's this default belief against the existence of any other supernatural entity called a small g God, other than the God of the Bible. And as we began pulling on these threads of research, you realize, okay, that's not what God said. God in the Bible calls them gods, and they were really important to the neighbors of the Hebrews and the Hebrew prophets knew what their neighbors believed. So maybe there's some, more that we could learn about the ancient world. Maybe some of these strange, hard to understand parts of the Bible are actually in response to things that their neighbors were doing in the ancient world. And the more we dug into the idea of the Rephaim and learned that the Rephaim, which is just a name given to the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed in the flood, we learned that scholars have known for at least the last 40 or 50 years that the pagans around ancient Israel not only knew who the Rephaim were, they worshiped them. And this is documented in texts that were recovered from a site in northern Syria, an Amorite kingdom called Ugarit.
Oh, yeah.
It was discovered by it's always a shepherd stumbling into a cave,
Right.
Around sometime in the 1920s. So for about 100 years, they've had access to these clay tablets that were preserved because the city was destroyed during what's called the Bronze Age collapse. The end of the Bronze Age ended in fire as most of the Eastern Mediterranean kingdoms, from the Hittites down almost to Egypt, were just wiped out. So these clay tablets were baked and preserved for the last 3,200 years, but it's only been about the last 40 years that scholars have come to agree, these Rephaim were a regular part of the worship of the neighbors of ancient Israel. There was a cult of the dead that permeated the culture of the ancient Near East around the Israelites, and the Israelites were drawn into this. And so as we dug into that and realized, okay, there's this one character who keeps showing up. If you compare the cosmologies, the religions of everything from ancient Sumer to Rome, the same pattern repeats over and over again, where there's a sky god who sort of creates everything. He's kind of pushed out of the picture by his son, who's usually a grain god of some kind. In some cases, there's a violent confrontation in which the sky god is castrated. And then he's in turn replaced by his son, the storm god, who takes over and becomes the king of the pantheon. So in ancient Sumer, this was Anu, the sky god, replaced by Marduk, the creator god, replaced by the storm god Marduk. In Canaan, it was Shemayim, replaced by El, replaced by Baal. For the Hittites, it was Anu, replaced by Kumarbi, replaced by Tarhunta. And in Greece, it was Uranus, replaced by Kronos, replaced by Zeus. And in Rome, it was Caelus, replaced by Saturn, replaced by Jupiter. So same pattern over and over again. And again, archaeologists and scholars have known this for decades now. The story of the Hittite and Hurrian sky god story, Kumarbi, they discovered that around World War II. And it's like, hey, wait a minute, we didn't make this up. The Greeks got this from further east. And oh, wait a minute, this tracks even further east. It all goes back to a same source. And we argue that source, the original story, is the one that's preserved in the Bible. So then the question becomes, okay, who is this dude? Saturn, Kronos, El, also known as Enlil, Dagon, Molech, Baal, multiple names.
List goes on.
List goes on, but fulfilling the same slot in the pantheon for each one of the cultures that worshipped him. And how is he manifested in the Bible? And as I started digging deeper into it, Sharon put me onto some research from a site in northern Syria called Tel Mozan, which is the ancient city of Urkesh. Founded by the Hurrians around 3500 BC. And that really opened the door to a lot of this, because there's some really fascinating leads. But the bottom line is this entity, who the Romans called Saturn, whose best known characteristic was eating his own children, and was the patron somehow of the most popular annual festival in Rome, the Saturnalia, is the character that the Hebrews called Shemiyaza, the leader of the rebellion on Mount Hermon that created these monstrous giant Nephilim. And I argue, as the king of the Titans, the king of those who were condemned to the netherworld, is the same character who's called the king of over those in the abyss in Revelation chapter 9, the destroyer, Apollyon or Abaddon.
Yeah.
So he's been in the abyss, right? Because of the angels that fell, committed that sin. The angels that came down on Mount Hermon.
And they're confined to Tartarus.
Right. They're in the abyss. They're in Tartarus, and he is the head over them. But he's been locked away. How is it that these cults to him have emerged and perpetuated since day one. If he wasn't active to intervene for them.
Well, that's a really good question. I would ask, how is it that a mob boss manages to control action on the streets from while he's in prison?
Ooh, yeah, good. That's
That's
good.
a good analogy.
Yeah.
I wish I'd thought of that. That's not original to me, but I speculate in the book because that's all we can do. I consider the Bible to be the authoritative book on the supernatural realm, or as L.A. Marzulli calls it, the guidebook to the supernatural.
Yeah.
And we're not told in the Bible what role demons play interacting between these fallen angels and the natural realm.
Yeah.
Okay, our working theory is this, that demons are the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed in the flood. That's explicit in the book of First Enoch, which really gives us detail on what happened in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It was the understanding of the early church. When you read the writings of the early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and others, it's clear that for the first 400 years after the resurrection, they believed that the origin of those demons that Jesus was casting out in the first century were the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood.
Wow.
It was after Augustine in the early 5th century, so in the early 400s, where he began writing out and codifying a theology that was formally adopted by the Roman Catholic Church and sort of became the default setting for Christian theology to this day, that all of that stuff in Genesis 6 didn't happen the way it says in the Bible. The Sethite view.
We don't really know why he did that, do we?
Well, he came out of a cult, and I forget the name of the cult that he came from, but it involved the worship of angels. And I think he wanted to move Christianity away from the idea that angels were
I've heard that
a thing.
Yeah.
And sort of oddly enough, as we documented in our book, Veneration, Sharon and I found that it was Augustine who's responsible for the veneration of saints in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches today. Because this cult of the dead that developed from this worship of these demonic spirits after the flood continued into the Christian era. In fact, we found that there's research showing that archaeologists digging in Rome, where you can't plant a garden without hitting archaeology, just like Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They found that the earliest Christian churches built after Constantine legalized the faith in the year 312 AD were built in cemeteries so that Christians could continue this practice of holding ritual meals for the spirits of their ancestors.
Wow.
It was believed that if you didn't do that, your grandparents, great-grandparents, your ancestors going back however many generations would cease to exist. You had to feed them and give them drink in the afterlife. This is documented going back to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC in ancient Sumer. 500 years before Abraham, there was this monthly ritual being performed by the Amorites to summon ancestors. Believe it or not, in ancient Mesopotamia, they were doing the ritual. Say their names.
Wow. Yeah.
Seriously. I mean, there
Wow.
3 elements to the ritual. Say their names, feed the statues, which are those teraphim that Jacob's wife Rachel stole from his father-in-law.
Yes.
That's what those statues were for.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
Ritual. Yeah. Which was held every month on the night of no moon because, that's when the veil is thinnest. And then they would pour out a libation, and that is also part of the modern day ritual. Say their names, then you pour out a drink offering in their honor. This was so important in the ancient world that the son, the eldest son, who was the one who'd inherit the family estate, was called the pourer of water, because you had to keep the ancestors alive by holding this ritual every month on the 30th of the month, a lunar calendar, the 30th night of no moon. Anyway, fast forward to the 1st century, 2nd century AD, 4th century AD, Augustine seeing Christians in Rome still doing this.
Yeah.
Even though for 400 years, the bishops, the teachers, the pastors have been saying, look, we don't do this anymore.
Yeah.
Couldn't stop it. So he said, okay, well, the saints of the ancestors, the saints, or rather the spirits of the saints, can intercede for us in the natural realm. And so they continued the practice in the veneration of saints. And it continues to this day among Roman Catholics and Orthodox.
Absolutely. It
So
does.
You just connected so many dots for me.
Right?
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
And it goes back to Mount Hermon, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it really does. And, that's one thing that Nick and I have really wrestled with over the past, probably 20 years for me, ever since our dad gave me Clarence Larkin's The Spirit World, which was like a book written literally almost 100 years ago. But Nick, you've been into this for the past, few years at least, ever since you started writing. And we both have kind of run into this problem where no one in mainstream thought wants to talk about Genesis 6. It's one of the reasons why we gravitate towards men like you and Gary Wayne, and these people who are willing to address this topic. Rob Skiba, was another one.
Michael Heiser.
Michael Heiser, yeah.
Michael Heiser, yeah. So, in fact, will you tell the seed of the serpent story?
Yeah.
Like, so, Nick has an example of this.
Yeah, to Jonathan's point. So we
least.
started going to a new church about 2 months ago, and they have this Wednesday night, kind of a Wednesday night. They call it coffee and theology. So while your kids are off doing youth group, the adults it's almost like a Wednesday night service, but they're teaching the congregation, solid theology. It's really good. And while they're teaching, if you have a question, they actually have a QR code up behind them, projected up behind them. So if you have a question, you can ask it anonymously, scan the code, send your question. And at the end of the class, they'll go through the questions and they'll answer them for everybody. And they were talking about the nature of sin in this particular one. They were talking about, the fall and man and nature of sin. And they were reading from Genesis 3 when God is reprimanding Adam and then Eve and then the serpent, the proto-evangelium. And he says to the servant, I will put enmity between you and the woman. I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. You will strike his heel and he will bruise your head, and so forth. And maybe I've listened to a little too much Chuck Missler, but I wanted to ask.
I said, grandpa that we all wish we,
everyone's favorite grandpa. Yeah. But I typed the question anonymously. Who or what is the seed of the serpent? We know what the seed of the woman is. Of course, obviously, it's Christ ultimately, but we're all the seed of Eve.
Yeah.
Who's the seed of the serpent?
Yeah.
I want to know, what is that?
Yeah.
What is he talking about?
Yeah.
And I sent the question in.
Very relevant question to the topic at hand, and what he was willing to.
I thought so. My wife was with me, and she said, "Like, all right, fine, I'll go ahead and send it." There were 12 questions total submitted for the class. About 100 people in the class. Only 12 questions got submitted. They answered 11 of them. They skipped mine. They ignored it. They didn't address it. They just pretended like it wasn't even submitted. Totally ignored it. And there were questions that were kind of joke questions,
right? Silly questions.
Yeah, all of those made the list, but they didn't want to touch it.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to this frustrating thing we keep running into where, there are people who, like Christians, who have questions about these things. There are non-Christians who have questions about them. They're looking for answers. Why won't pastors give an answer? Why can't it's not from, you don't hear it in the pulpit.
It's stricken from the seminary curriculum.
Yeah.
I ran into it when I was 17, when I first started writing the Heavenly Realms novels. The pastor's wife of Lighthouse Christian tried to argue with me and give the Sethite view, So our question, Derek, is why is this a verboten topic in the church?
Well, that's a good question. And unfortunately, I can't answer that, not being a pastor, not having formal seminary training. So I can't really address that. I guess I'm what you call an autodidact, which is just a fancy name for, I'm a nerd and I read a lot.
Self-taught nerd.
Yeah.
Join the club, baby.
I don't know. We've been friends with a number of pastors, and we've talked about some of these issues with them. And we bring up something like, say, transhumanism, which seems to be a pretty relevant topic right about now when you got the World Economic Forum talking about their fourth industrial revolution, and we're going to overcome death with technology. And very well-educated pastors, one of whom was an expert on the Apostolic Fathers. A guy, I was like, Irenaeus, who is he? And he would, be able to give really good answers. Had never heard the word transhumanism, much less a definition. So I can only guess that it's because this has been avoided in seminaries, and because pastors, the ones that we've known, have so many other demands on their time,
right,
that it's not something that most of them will devote a lot of time to, just because they can't. They've got a congregation that they're trying to minister to. They've got a family, a wife and children that they're trying to be a responsible husband and father to. Or in the case of the women out there who are pastors, Sharon's niece is a really fireball evangelist. So, you've got other demands on your time. And here we are, God has just put Sharon and me in a situation and led us down paths of study. Sharon, with her background as she got both halves of her brain going on. I only work with half.
Us too.
She was a gifted vocalist who sang professionally for a couple of decades and then went back to school and got a degree as a molecular biologist.
Wow.
How does that happen?
Man. Yeah.
So, but all of that has led to where we are now, where she can draw on that for the fiction that she writes, for the presentations that she gives on topics like transhumanism and end times prophecy, and me, where I've just been able to indulge this love for reading and learning in study here. I can only guess it's because it's not been taught. It's not been the default teaching for Christian theologians since the time of Augustine, who was a brilliant man, but wrong about this. That most pastors aren't willing to buck what they've been taught. I mean, this is not what I was taught in seminary, and I've got other things I've got to deal with. We got a Wednesday night sermon to prepare, and then I've got 2 for Sunday to prepare, and we've got this, that, and
Sure.
So that's my guess. That's my guess.
Yeah.
Well, and that would make sense too, because I know that Rob Skiba used to talk about how it's perceived as empty calorie. I think is how he would describe it, and
I suppose.
And that's it opens up this great window of opportunity though for people such as yourself and Gary Wayne, who devotes 30 years to writing this tome of a book, and for you and Sharon, who write multiple novels and multiple nonfiction books about this topic. It's a great opportunity, but it's just at the same time you try to talk about how a lot of this stuff is the linchpin to understanding so many esoteric things that are behind the scenes and understanding life, and governments and empires.
And as we watch the world get increasingly weird year over year, more and more people are going to come forward with questions about this, and the church is not ready to answer those questions.
And there's so many, there's so many little tangential things. They seem tangential in the Bible that we have, with Jesus taking the sons of thunder up to Mount Hermon, and then all of these little references that are in the New Testament that refer back to this Nephilim story, this story of the Watchers and the 200 coming down, and no one knows what to do with any of this stuff. Like the thing with demons, no one. There's such a great misunderstanding about the difference, and this is something that I struggled with when I tried to pitch my books to, Christian publishers and people in the industry. They were like, "Well, what's the difference between demons and fallen angels?" And it's like, okay. All right, we got to roll this back then, I guess, and let me get the dry erase board. No one wants to address it. No one thinks that it's necessary, or they don't know what to do with it. And so it's just, if I could just shine a spotlight like a bat signal,
hand him this book. That'll get him thinking.
And you know what? This book is really, it's really well written. It's such an easy flowing read. I had a lot of fun reading this book. The prose itself is it lends itself to just it's a fast read, honestly. I sat down for one day, and I'm such a laboriously slow reader, but I blew through 50-60 pages just sitting down and then you're like, oh hey, okay, I had no idea this is
my wife didn't know I had read it. Didn't know it had come in the mail until I was already done with it.
Really
full of highlighter and everything.
And it's a good move on your part too, because Derek, because the material itself can be kind of heady, and it is so well researched, but when you lay it out in such a smooth prose, it's so easily digestible.
Let me ask you a question about your book. For the Christian layman, or let's say maybe a patriotic newcomer to this particular channel and they're watching this, what is the relevance of the second coming of Saturn?
It is prophetic. And I give credit to Tom Horn for, in all of the books that we've written, saying, okay, well, this is all really interesting history, but why does it matter to us today? Because unless you can make it relevant to us today, people aren't going to understand why they should read it. Won't matter. It's like, okay, curious, history's boring. I'm not going to read it. The reason that the United States Capitol is on the cover of the book is again, I'll credit where it's due. Sharon had spotted something during a chapter for a chapter that she wrote for Tom Horn's Zeitgeist 2025. Both of us contributed chapters to the book.
Oh, yeah.
And she noted that January 6th, the date of the the so-called
Insurrection.
Of last year.
Yeah.
That date happens to fall on that event happened to fall on a date that's rather significant in the Christian calendar. That's the date called Epiphany or Theophany in the Eastern calendar, which is a date of that Christ's divinity was revealed to the three wise men. Okay, that's a traditional thing, but it's kind of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink in the to the occult realm and the spirit realm. Tom Horn has written a couple of books now about the occult. The significance of the occult symbolism built into the United States Capitol, and in a broader sense, Washington, D.C. as a whole. The documentary Belly of the Beast, the books Apollyon Rising 2012, Zenith 2016, even Zeitgeist 2025 kind of goes back and touches on the same themes. But where I think Tom is correct in seeing in the United States Capitol symbolism that points to a secret society or a cult desire to bring back this entity called Apollyon. But Tom identifies Apollyon as the Antichrist, whereas I think it's this entity the Romans called Saturn. And I see significance and symbolism in the apotheosis of Washington that suggests that he was depicted in that painting, not just as rising to take his place among the assembly of the gods in the heavens, but specifically as Saturn, or as this old god who is coming to, he believes, reclaim his rightful place as the ruler of creation. When you connect that to the chapters in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, which I argue were not directed at Satan, but at this entity, Apollyon or Abaddon in the Hebrew. This entity, I think, is separate and distinct from Satan, led the rebellion in Genesis 6, which is separate from the Genesis 3 rebellion of the serpent in the garden, that being Satan. I think there are occult groups out there, occult adepts, who are actively working towards bringing this entity back to earth. Now, the Bible tells us he will come back, Revelation chapter 9, but when he comes back, he only gets 5 months, which bookends the 150 days that Noah's ark was on the water. Genesis 7 and 8, we're told that the ark was on the water for 150 days, which in a lunar calendar is exactly 5 months before it came to land in the mountains of Ararat, which I think is more evidence that we're looking at this same creature, this entity who led the rebellion that prompted God to send the flood of Noah, gets out at the end and gets 5 months to torment those without the seal of God in their foreheads. So that's the significance for Christians today. The encouraging thing, though, is that, first of all, setting aside the argument over when, if there's a rapture, and if so, when does it happen, which is a sure way to divide any group of Christians into camps, pre, mid, post, pre-wrath, whatever. It doesn't whatever. Because either way, any way you slice it, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you've got the seal of God on your foreheads, and this creature can't touch you.
Yeah,
I think Sharon and I both believe that the pre-tribulation rapture is correct. The evidence points to that. So we won't be here when this creature gets out of the abyss. But even if we are, we're protected. So that's the encouraging thing for believers. The good news is you don't have anything to fear from this entity, but let's understand why certain things are happening in the world around us that otherwise make no sense. If you don't view the world through a supernatural lens, through a biblical lens, things happening in the world like the massacre in Uvalde this past week make no sense. The Christian worldview and the existence of intelligent evil helps understand why bad things happen to good people.
Beyond just the rains fall on the just and the unjust alike. You know, it does help you understand that there are dark forces behind the scenes that are manipulating and, you know, creating machinations that do manifest, and all of these little Baphomet cults and these Luciferian ideologies.
Well,
and
kind of tied to that too. A couple weeks ago, they had that big Senate hearing on UFOs.
oh, right.
You know, how would you? I mean, knowing this, how would you use this as a way to interpret what's going on in light of this recent phenomenon?
Well, Sharon and I included a section in our book Veneration about that. And actually, it was drawn from research that I did for the book Josh Peck and I wrote back in 2017, which came out the week before the New York Times broke that story of the Tic Tac from the 2004 Nimitz incident. In fact, we were just watching a documentary on that this afternoon.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the book Josh and I wrote called The Day the Earth Stands Still, which is a play on that old 1952 movie. With Michael Rennie.
Yeah.
You know, the remake with Keanu Reeves, haven't watched it, don't care to. But, you know, Klaatu, Barada, Nikto, that's classic. This is a spiritual, it is a supernatural phenomenon. It is not a technological phenomenon. There is no evidence. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that Earth has been visited by inhuman entities for literally millennia, but there's no evidence, no credible evidence that these entities are coming from outside of our solar system. They've been with us the whole time. Even some of the secular researchers like Jacques Vallée, Dr. John Mack, acknowledge that some of the things reported by experiencers and contactees is more of a supernatural phenomenon than anything else. That these things only appear to be violating the laws of physics because they're moving into and out of our perceivable dimensions. So we're limited to perceiving 3 spatial dimensions and then time, whereas advanced mathematics has shown that there are as many as 11 dimensions. There's some actually. Chuck Missler talked about this. That the medieval rabbi Maimonides, just looking at the book of Genesis, concluded there were 11 dimensions originally.
Isn't that incredible?
Jeez,
yeah,
that's crazy.
What a mind to be able to do that and to be able to do it without Google, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Reading books.
Yeah. With an abacus and some papyrus.
Yes. So Adam and Eve, when they were kicked out of the garden, just were suddenly now limited to not being able to perceive it in that dimension. And I think there's some evidence out there that is that we may be able to open ourselves to those dimensions through things like mindfulness or DMT, ayahuasca, spirit molecule experiments of Dr. Rick Strassman years ago.
Yep.
But we're not supposed to, which is why God told Moses, don't consult with necromancers, don't consult with mediums. Isn't it interesting when you're talking about the alien contactee phenomenon that all of this contact is coming through telepathy? I mean, we're supposed to believe that these entities somehow solved the engineering challenges of moving an object from one solar system to another.
Yeah.
Dealing with the amount of energy required to move something that distance, dealing with the radiation you would be exposed to over through interstellar space. And yet somehow when they got here, they don't know how to use a webcam.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
and this is something that Derek has definitely thought about as a hard science fiction aficionado, and as a correct me if I'm wrong, you've written science fiction novels as well. Is that right? I know you've written fantasy.
Yeah, there was one, and I've never been a big fan of fantasy. So Iron Dragons, I find a way to explain the dragons as in a science fiction context.
It's pretty cool.
So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was my first attempt at a novel, was a science fiction one, because I was such a huge Babylon 5 fan. And then you were a
huge Babylon 5 fan.
Babylon 5 and Gettysburg. I quickly realized I am not smart enough to get this down. So we're just gonna do angels and medieval warfare.
There you go. Well, so Eric, I have a question for you. This is a little bit of a turn away from what we've been discussing so far, but you have proposed that, and you've taken this question before, so I know you're ready for it. Satan and Lucifer, may not be the same thing. May not be the same entity. Can you expound on that a little bit and tell people how you came to that conclusion?
Well, it was really reading carefully Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. And when you start digging into Isaiah 14, and you realize that, and scholars will agree, I mean, Bible students will agree that those two chapters are parallel chapters. They refer to the same rebellion, but nothing in Isaiah 14, which is the famous, "How art thou fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning," it doesn't ever in that chapter or in Ezekiel 28 specifically make mention of what happened in Genesis chapter 3, the temptation of Adam and Eve. So there's nothing there that specifically we just have always assumed that must be referring to that incident because that's the only rebellion in the garden, right?
And Lucifer is referred to as walking amongst the fiery stones, so we sort of equate him with being in the garden, and the two become conflated to the point where
circular logic.
Simple.
Right. It's circular logic when you assume that there's only one rebellion, so it must refer to. But and it took me probably 15 years to come around to this because a friend of ours named David W. Lowe wrote a book years back, 15 years ago, called Deconstructing Lucifer, where he made that argument. That and he actually went in and showed that it was a process of a couple of centuries after the resurrection. The early church did not consider Lucifer and Satan. They didn't see Satan in either Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28. It was a process of a couple of centuries.
Interesting.
Until about the time of Origen and Jerome, who translated the Vulgate Bible, which is where we get the Lucifer. It's Latin, lux, and ferus, meaning light bringer, which is a translation of the Hebrew, Halel ben Shachar, light bringer, son of dawn. Again, there's nothing in there that specifically connects Satan, assuming again, and I'm willing to accept this, that he is the serpent, the Nakash, in Genesis chapter 3. There's nothing that connects as Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 to Genesis 3, other than the assumption that this must be the rebellion that's being discussed here because we don't know of any others, except that we look carefully at Jude verses 6 and 7 and 2 Peter 2, verse 4, when Peter, for example, refers to God not sparing the angels when they sinned. Wait a minute, angels plural. So there's more than one here. Who are these others? And when you read Jude and Peter in context, you see that they were specifically referring to a sexual sin. Now, there's nothing in the Old Testament that connects Satan to any kind of a sexual sin other than those who try to read into Genesis chapter 3 and saying, yes, the serpent's seed is Satan and Eve. No. Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. Genesis 3 verse 1 specifically says Adam was the father of Cain. Put that one to rest. Anyway, the Jews in the Old Testament, when you look at the other mentions of Satan in the Old Testament, there is nothing there that connects Satan to the underworld or to the Nephilim or the Rephaim, the later form of the Nephilim, anywhere. Satan, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, both make it clear that this rebel is kicked out of Eden and cast down to the netherworld, to Sheol. The shades in Isaiah 14, which is the Rephaim in the Hebrew, rise up to greet him when he falls. Ezekiel 28, when you read Ezekiel in context, Ezekiel's got a lot to say about the netherworld. You get into Ezekiel 31 and 32, and you read about the chiefs of the Gibberim, the chiefs, the mighty chiefs who are in the midst of Sheol. And then you compare that with the Septuagint translation, you see that it's clear they're talking about the giants of old who were cast down to Sheol. There's the context for what you're seeing in Ezekiel 28 with this entity of cast out of Eden down to the netherworld. But Satan still has access to the throne room. I mean, Job, hey, where have you been? Walking to and fro in the earth. Hey, check out this friend, this guy Job. Look how righteous he is. You also see in Zechariah where Satan appears and challenges or accuses the high priest named Joshua in the days of Zerubbabel. So he's still got access to the throne room of God. The Jews in the time of the apostles never considered Satan as an underworld figure connected to the dead. There's nothing in the Old Testament that gives us that
interesting
that connection. This was something that developed in the centuries after the resurrection in the early Christian church. Now, it's not to say that this character that we come to know as Lucifer is a good guy. I mean, he's not. I mean, the whole point of writing my book is arguing, say, hey, we've missed one here.
Right, yeah.
Even worse than Satan, if that's even possible. Because when you read Ezekiel 28 and you see, every precious stone was your covering.
Yeah.
And when you read that and you read and compare it to the Septuagint, which is the older translation from Hebrew into Greek, about 200 BC. So 200 years before Christ was born, the Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated texts we don't have access to anymore. They've got 12 stones that matches the 12 stones of the ephod, the high priest.
Yep.
It's like, so this entity in Ezekiel, this entity in Isaiah 14 might have been the high priest in Eden.
Yeah.
And then he rebelled and was cast out. Like, that's really interesting. But the final piece of evidence was when our friend Dr. Doug Hamp, who's written 3 books under the name Corrupting the Image, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And in volume 2, he talked about the Mount Hermon inscription, wrote about that. He drew some new information from that stone, the first new information from the inscription in 100 years, which is really fascinating. But he pointed me to a paper by Dr. William Gallagher, written about almost 30 years ago now, where he showed how Halel ben Shachar is what you get when you transliterate from the original Akkadian into West Semitic, like Ugaritic, and then into Hebrew, the name Enlil. Like, okay, because Enlil, again, is this Canaanite creator god El, who was later known to the Greeks as Kronos and to the Romans as Saturn. So there's the connection. And it's connected to Doug's research and his new translation of the Mount Hermon inscription, which was found on the summit of Mount Hermon by Sir Charles Warren in 1869. Which so you've got this connection now, this chief god, this creator god of the Greeks, Romans, Canaanites, Amorites, Akkadians, Babylonians, Hurrians, Hittites, et cetera, and the summit of Mount Hermon.
Yeah.
And I think he's the one who is being referred to in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. It's not Satan, it's Saturn, Shemiyaza, the leader of this rebellion, who created the giants, the Nephilim, the cult of the dead, demons that afflict us to this day, and the one who is called the Destroyer, Abaddon or Apollyon.
Wow.
And that's the interesting thing about these two, these two conflicting antagonists. They're almost, it's possible that and this was one of our other questions, are they antagonists against each other? We know they're in a way antagonists towards us, in that Satan, whatever his role is the accuser,
right?
And then Lucifer, Abaddon, Apollyon, Shemiyaza, the leader of the Watchers, there's a more tangible, practical threat, a persistent, tactile threat almost in some ways, that's just with all of the Nephilim, and then the Nephilim empires, and then the royal bloodlines, and just this cult, the Saturnalia cult, the cube of Saturn, it's so persistent, it permeates through everything. And yet, ironically, he's locked away in the abyss, and yet, his empire continues, and then you have like the weird overlaps with Lucifer, Lightbringer, Prometheus, the punishment of Prometheus, so there, and Zeus and Washington, and no one worships Kronos, but everyone worships Zeus, even though and no one worships the predecessor to Kronos, except for probably some weird fringe mystery cult, that probably
that's the thing is that again, Sharon pointed me to this ancient Hurrian city called Urkesh, where this husband and wife archaeologists from UCLA, the Bucciolatis, been working there since the 1990s, but sadly, frustratingly, can't get into the country now because of that Syrian civil war since 2011. In fact, that area is just read this morning, the Turkish government's getting the rumors wanting to set up a 30-kilometer security zone inside Syria, so they may be, invading that very area here in the next week or two. But it's not that far from Göbekli Tepe, maybe
really?
25 miles. Yeah, it's really not that far from that area if you want to go back another 8,000 years. But about 3,500 BC, this city was developing in what was northern Mesopotamia at the time. Now, scholars have assumed since the discoveries in Sumer, southeast Iraq, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that civilization began there at cities like Ur and Nippur and Eridu, and moved northward from there. But that's been changing the last 20 years as they found sites in the north like Tel Mozan and others that were just as developed at the same period of history as the ancient Sumerian cities. So this site developed by the Hurrians, and they were able to identify this because of some very unique, well, a couple of things. First of all, the fact that the Hurrian religious texts were preserved by the Hittites in what is now central Turkey for like 2,000 years. Okay, so around the time of the Judges, when the Hittite kingdom fell, they had preserved ancient religious texts from the Hurrians that were 2,000 years old then. Okay, and one of the key elements of worship was this ritual pit at the site.
Oh, yes.
That goes down about 40 feet called the Abi, the ABI. And according to the Hittite texts, the purpose of this was to go down into this pit and draw a magic circle on the floor and maybe mark it out with flour or salt or something. That sounds familiar to certain practices today. And sacrifice a small animal, a piglet or a lamb or a puppy they would even use, and then summon these entities from the netherworld. And then ask them for favors. And then when they were done, they would cover up the hole and would put a reed lid on top of it. I guess a lid, a covering made of reeds was strong enough to keep these spirits in the netherworld. But this goes back to like 3,500 BC, they estimate, based on the depth of the hole and the age of the broken pottery and things that they found in the hole, as far down as they were able to get. But the pottery that they found at this site, and this is really fascinating, is tied to a culture, an older culture that archaeologists call the Kura-Araxes civilization, which are named for the two rivers on either side of the Caucasus Mountains in Armenia and Turkey. In other words, this civilization migrated there around 4,500 BC. They spread out going southeast to Iran, southwest down as far as the Sea of Galilee in Israel, and then into what is now northern Syria and northern Iraq. But that area in between the Caucasus Mountains is the plains of Ararat. In other words, the area below the mountains where Noah's Ark came to rest.
Right.
So after the flood, some of the descendants of Noah said, "Hey, we need to get back in touch with those old gods who are down in the netherworld now."
Yeah, because they were the ancient powers that were wiped out by the flood.
Attack them. Yeah. Well, in the book, I show some of the research that scholars have pieced together, and I'm making a short story long. But the bottom line is this word Abi is the origin of the Hebrew word Ov, which is translated medium in the Bible. So when King Saul, the night before he died, went to consult the medium of Endor, he was consulting the Ov of Endor. And that story where she summoned the spirit of the prophet Samuel came up from the earth because she was using a ritual pit, just like they've been using, the Hurrians had been using for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So it all connects together, and we can draw it a straight line back to the Ararat Plain below where the Ark came to rest. Judd Burton wrote a paper last summer in which he traced the phoneme, which is a little piece of language behind the words in most of the modern Eurasian languages for ruler or king or royalty, and traced it back to the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Well, that's that area between the Caucasus Mountains, the Greater and Lesser Caucasus, the Ararat Plain. That phoneme includes the Hebrew word Rephaim. So we were working on this independently. It's like, okay, final edit. The book wasn't done yet, which is why, if you've seen in the book, I cite Judd's research in there because to me, this is just more confirmation. We can trace all of this back to these watchers led by this character, Shemiyaza, who the Romans called Saturn.
Yeah, man. Do you have a question?
Well, yeah.
Because I have a follow-up too.
Do you?
Yeah.
Go ahead, because mine always like a dovetail.
Well,
Ramble forever.
So Shemyaza, the leader of the Watchers. These are the angels that came down. They, through their sin with human women, created the Nephilim.
Yeah.
Right. The Nephilim were wiped out by the flood, and then we get the Rephaim, the spirits, the demon. What many believe are the demon spirits that are roaming during the time of Christ all the way up to today. The parentage of which is in the abyss.
Yeah.
We also, at the same time, have Satan, who is working against those who follow the Lord, working against
the accuser,
Christians. He's the accuser of the brethren.
Yeah.
And, we've always assumed that the demons are the fallen angels that serve Satan. I don't believe that anymore. I believe, but at the same time, I'm trying to figure out what is the relationship now. If demons are the offspring, if they're the Nephilim spirits, the offspring of Shemyaza, who's locked away.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between them and Satan? Does he coerce them?
Does he
co-opt
work with them?
Does he
Are
bully
they,
them? Like,
right?
What do you suspect?
Are they competitors?
That's a really good question. I talked with L.A. Marzulli about this some months ago and said, okay, let's throw out a hypothetical here. What scenario do you see? Okay, Satan had his rebellion where he got Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden, and now they're going to suffer death, which they would not have suffered before because they disobeyed God. Why then would this other rebellion take place? Was this other guy? I mean, my assumption is that the fallen realm are like Democrats, and I'm just using Democrats for an example. There's no any resemblance between Democrats and fallen angels or demons is purely, coincidental. But just like in the 2020 election, they all were united in their opposition to Donald Trump. They were all fighting with one another over who got to sit in the chair next. So I think that's what we're looking at with the fallen realm. And LA said, maybe the whole point of creating the Nephilim was to create an army that would supplant humanity, that we were created to take dominion of the earth.
Right.
So that a human would... You would need to be fully human in order to become king of the world, as it were. The Nephilim were an attempt to replace humanity by two ways, perhaps. One, by just wiping out the human race, which God didn't allow. Or secondly, by creating a hybrid who would just rule over the human race. And again, God didn't allow that. He put a stop to that. But according to First Enoch, and again, the understanding of the early church was that these spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood were condemned to wander the earth, tormenting humanity until the final judgment. Well, after the flood, we see in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 and 9, when God divided the nations, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. The older translations will say the number of the sons of Israel. That's based on the Masoretic text. But the Septuagint, which again is the older text translated by Jewish religious scholars 200 years before the birth of Jesus from older Hebrew texts, they understood that these were spirit beings, not the sons of Israel in Deuteronomy. In other words, when God divided the nations, he placed the nations under the authority, or at least the supervision, of these other sons of God. So other angels, other angelic beings were sort of delegated the task of supervising humanity. And we can see that they chose to exercise their authority badly. Psalm 82 is like a courtroom scene where God takes his place in the midst of the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he renders judgment. How long will you rule unjustly? Though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. So they're under a death sentence. This would include, I think, Satan, who Jesus in Matthew 12, verses 22 through 26, identified as Baal. This was the scene where Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, Baal the prince. And Jesus says, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will his kingdom stand? Which is interesting, because now we've learned something else interesting, that by the time of the New Testament, Satan is no longer just wandering the earth. He's got a kingdom.
Right.
The prince of this world, the God of this world. So that's interesting. We also see this connection in Revelation 2, the letter that Jesus dictates to John for the church at Pergamum. I know where you live, where Satan dwells. That's a reference to the Greek form of the storm god, Baal. Zeus says Satan is Zeus, Satan is Baal, Satan is the storm god. So he's got a kingdom now on this earth, whereas this other dude, who's now in the abyss, who was perhaps the high priest in Eden prior to his fall, is waiting for his chance to come out and plotting along with his children, his minions, and looking for his return. So what is the connection? Yeah, what is the connection in the end times? Sharon and I have dealt with that. In fact, we've got a program coming up on Unraveling Revelation. I think next week we release it on, we titled the program Hell on Earth, because, you know, what's the connection? Satan is clearly in the book of Revelation the leader of the end times rebellion. This character called the Destroyer gets out, but he only gets 5 months. Then there's the woman in scarlet, the woman who rides the beast, the Antichrist. Sharon has convinced me that this is the entity called Inanna by the Sumerians, or Ishtar by the Akkadians and Babylonians. Aphrodite to the Greeks, the Romans. Queen of Heaven, she is called.
Queen of Heaven.
Yes. She was the original gender fluid entity on planet Earth. There are Sumerian hymns praising her for being able to change women to men and men to women. And anyway,
that's the age we live in.
Wow.
Right. When you read the myths and the stories about Inanna in ancient Sumer, and how she was called the Queen of Heaven then, and then after the death of the Bull of Heaven, part of the Gilgamesh epic, the Bull of Heaven was the consort of her sister, who was queen of the underworld. So she goes down to the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, and it's clear from the story that Ereshkigal realizes what Inanna is trying to do. She wants to become the queen of the netherworld as well as the Queen of Heaven. And she'd already tricked her uncle, Enki, who was the clever god, who was the god of the Abzu, the abyss, into giving up the Mez, which were the rules or the principles that guided human civilization. So she controlled the Mez, which was what governed human life on Earth. She was the Queen of Heaven, trying to become the queen of the netherworld. And in Revelation, she's the one who's riding the Antichrist, riding the beast.
Oh, wow.
Thinks that she's going to rule. So you've got these competing interests, I think, in the end times. You got Satan, who's supposedly leading this, the Antichrist, who we argue is Leviathan, chaos. You've got Destroyer, who comes out in Revelation 9 with his minions, the Titans. And then you got the woman in scarlet, who thinks she's going to rule until the beast turns on her and destroys her. So, yeah, I think what you're seeing is like a political party where they all want to unseat Yahweh, the God of the Bible, but they all fight with each other as to who's going to rule in his place.
Yeah. Pelosi, AOC, Clintons, Hillary,
who's gonna
Hill Dog, you know. I'll leave it up to you to figure out which one of those is the beast and which is the harlot.
Exactly.
You know, it's always so interesting reading this stuff through a biblical lens, a Christian esoteric lens, because you see the parallels and the overlap, the Venn diagram between all the different religions, and how it's kind of, they're all just telling the same
story,
the same depressing story, because it's like you look at Zeus. You know, what is one of the things that Zeus is always in trouble for is coming down to earth, and sometimes he's a bull and sometimes he's a swan, and you know,
sometimes he's an eagle.
Yeah, sometimes he's an eagle where the eagles are gathered, you know, and he's always finding some chick, and maybe every now and then some dude. Well, and you know, it's always getting him in trouble, and it's just, you know, it's the story. It's the Mount Hermon story over and over again.
That's very true. And in fact, that was one bit of symbolism that Sharon picked up on that's in the book. The apotheosis of Washington depicts young America as a young man wearing a Phrygian cap, which is kind of that floppy, pointed-headed cap that you see. It's also called a Liberty cap, but Ganymede...
The libertine cap.
Yeah, I think that's a better way of describing it. Ganymede was...
Oh, yeah.
Was a shepherd, but he was like the son of the king of Troy. And Zeus saw that this young man was fair. He was comely to look at. And so Zeus swept down as an eagle and carried him off to to Olympus. And most of the stories that kids read, it's cleaned up. So they carried him up to Olympus to become cupbearer of the gods. Well, yeah, look at some of the paintings of this. It's pretty clear the eagle is really enjoying himself a lot more than Ganymede was. But
it's not this kind of cup that they're talking about. It's a different cupbearer. You know?
Here's the thing: if you compare this, going back to what I mentioned earlier about that monthly ritual, where you were feeding the dead, feeding the ancestors, and a key part of that ritual was pouring water.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got the water bearer, the cup pourer, the cup bearer on Mount Olympus, and when all of this was done, when Ganymede died, Zeus immortalized him by putting him in the stars as Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was and getting back to the U.S. Capitol on the cover there, it was the great conjunction of December 21st of 2020, the winter solstice, where Jupiter and Saturn met at 0 degrees of Aquarius in the night sky. And we understand as Christians that the movement of the planets in the heavens have no impact whatsoever, no influence over our destinies, our fortunes, or anything like that.
Right.
But in fact, God specifically warned against doing that sort of divination or fortune. But there are some very prominent, very powerful people who do believe that this is a thing. I mean, Nancy Reagan used to set Ronald's calendar on the advice of her astrologer. So there are some very powerful people who believe that signified, the winter solstice of 2020 signified the official final entry of the world into the age of Aquarius, which is a constellation under the old style of astrology ruled by Saturn. So going back to an old way of doing things, in other words, we've returned to the golden age where Saturn reigns. And this is why that poem by Virgil, the fourth eclogue, is mentioned in the book. Tom Horn, again, has written about this a number of times in his books. It's a belief that the world is on the verge of a new golden age. Returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. No, we saw that story before. That's Genesis 6. But this is what Virgil, the Roman poet Virgil, wrote about 40 years before the birth of Jesus. And again, there are occult adepts who think that this is a good thing and we should be working toward that. And so all of this, again, just 2 weeks after that great conjunction, we had the incident at the United States Capitol with all of the symbolism built into that
chaos magic. You had mentioned something about the guy with the buffalo horns in another interview. Forgive me for not remembering which one. Practicing chaos magic at the time.
Sharon talked about this, and this was in her chapter for Zeitgeist 2025, which she graciously allowed me to steal for
you guys are a match made in heaven, 5 miles more and you never would have met each other.
Yes.
That's so awesome.
God's handiwork there.
No kidding.
But she pointed out that this fella, and we spotted this going back to my book, Last Clash of the Titans, that buffalo imagery or bison imagery is all over the ancient world. That in ancient Sumer, you could tell who the gods were in their art by looking for the helmet with the multiple sets of horns.
The horns of power. It's even in the 13th Warrior, the leader of the bad guys, the Vendole. He wears the horns of power. It's all over a cult. Propaganda.
So it's in fact, one of the things that was startling was finding the scholarly research that confirms this. A fellow whose work I've read just about everything he's written, Dr. Nicholas Wyatt, or I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of what he's written. He specializes in these Ugaritic texts and how it overlaps with the Bible. And he pointed out that the name of the king of the Titans in Greek, Kronos, derives from a Semitic word that means horns. So he is literally the horned one. And Cernunnos, who's the horned god of the Celts, a variant of that. But even the name of the Titans derives from an ancient Amorite word taken from the Akkadian name for the aurochs, the bison, the buffalo. They were the bulls, basically. And this is what we're looking at on January 6th last year, Epiphany. The day when Christ's divinity is revealed to the three wise men. This guy wearing the bison hat, the buffalo hat, leads the group into America's Temple, as it was called by many of our political leaders, Schumer, Pelosi, many others.
And it's a conception ritual because the Capitol is supposed to be sort of like, if I remember correctly, the Capitol is the womb, and the Washington Monument, the
Right.
obelisk, is the phallic symbol, and
Right.
the pool between them. Yeah, so
Mm.
it's such a desecration.
Yeah.
And you're looking at something that's so ancient, and it seems so random. That was, I mean, you want to talk about like kind of playing your hand a little bit. They mocked this guy. They talked about this guy. There was all this talk about whether this dude was QAnon or whether he was, deep state or whatever. Well, there was that whole, Hegelian dialectic dual narrative, but he's still wearing this weird buffalo headdress. And here we are.
And I think as Christians, we have to understand, as Paul wrote, that we're not wrestling against human opponents, but against principalities and powers and cosmic rulers over this present darkness. That a lot of these things, I think, are done by people who don't know what they're doing. I mean, even Christ on the cross said, God will forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
True.
Did Constantino Bramiti, who painted the apotheosis of Washington, consciously put the purple cloth around Washington's legs in the same way that the statue of Saturn in his temple in ancient Rome had its legs wrapped, except during the Saturnalia, which symbolized him getting out of Tartarus? Probably not. Did he know that he was depicting young America like Ganymede, who was the boy toy of Satan, Zeus? Probably not. But somewhere in the spirit realm, you probably got these demons who are getting like bonuses for whispering into the ears of these guys and getting this stuff done. The Jacob Chansley, Jacob Angel, his stage name, Jacob Angeli. Okay, Angel. Okay. Did he really understand what he was doing?
Right.
I don't think he did. He, based on the interviews and things I've read about him and seen about him, he seems like kind of a confused young man who's looking for attention, but like that can be manipulated.
Well, that's a big thing, and because you were in secular radio for a little while, that's a big thing with the hip hop community and with the rap and mainstream rap culture, and there's all this Illuminati imagery that they're doing and participating in. And it's Masonic, and it's a cult, mystery cult, stuff. And same thing. How many of these people know what they're doing? Are they conscious of what the symbols mean, or are they doing it? Even if they are they doing it just like you say, not because the stars have any real power over humanity, but because they think it does. So they're practicing these rituals, trying to curry favor, and it creates this whole like false empire. This,
Yeah, I think that's it. Sharon and I are working on a book now called The Gates of Hell, and it's started out originally as a little light reading,
right? Yeah,
started out as a look at the geography of the Levant, which is Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Western Syria.
Cool.
And where some of the more supernatural things took place. I did a presentation a couple of years ago on the Jordan Rift, which is a fault line that runs. The Jordan River basically is on top of a rift between two plates, and they're moving at different speeds, which is why you've got the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, Lake Hula, which is mostly drained, but there the Bekaa Valley between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains. It's all a rift that goes down all the way into Africa and extends up north into Turkey. So a lot of geologic seismic activity along that line over the years. They're really overdue for a massive earthquake. They've had a number of them, oddly enough, during the 11th century, during the Crusades, almost like there were forces fighting in the earth. I mean, really massive earthquakes were felt as far away as Sicily and stuff. But when you look at where a lot of the supernatural events in the Bible, most of them occurred within, say, 25, 30 miles either side of that line, with the exception of like the Tower of Babel and maybe the parting of the Red Sea. But depending on where that took place, if it was the Red Sea, well, the Red Sea is right on that rift as well. But as we began to do more research on it, we thought, okay, no, that's almost like we're giving credence to the idea that there are certain places on the planet where there are portals, and that portals can be opened through magical workings. And Mike Heiser said something really wise once. We cite Heiser at least once in every interview, just because his work is so foundational and because he's really insightful when it comes to this. He said, look, most of us in the fringe Christian community have heard of the Babylon working of Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard back in 1947. And there are some who will look at that working and say that they opened a portal and somehow something came through, and that led to what happened in the late 40s. I mean, Israel became a nation, but we also had the Roswell incident and Kenneth Arnold with his UFO sighting, and the modern UFO phenomenon really began right about the time of right about the time of Hubbard and Parsons. But
maybe it was Lamb who got through.
Could be. Or a evil twin brother, Ram, or I don't know.
Sorry.
But that interesting little Crowley vision that he had there in the Great Pyramid. But the way Mike put it, I thought was really insightful. It's look, if these entities that we're so afraid of have to wait for a couple of sexual deviants to do perverted sex rites in the desert to get permission to come into our time-space domain, they're pretty lame.
Right, yeah. How scared should we be of these guys if they're waiting on a couple of weirdo pervs?
Yeah, greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. So, okay. But there are more and more people who are giving permission to these entities to take access. So the gates of hell, this is the way the book is developing, will be, inside the heart of the individual, in what those who give permission to these entities to use them for their own purposes. And I think there are more and more of them out there today. So that's the gates of hell is right there.
It really is. And Jordan Peterson talks about that, how like the line between good and evil, it runs right down the middle of every human's heart. And that is a very biblical concept in a lot of ways. And you feel it. You feel it when you're about to say something or do something, when you are opening a door, and sometimes there's seminal moments in your life, and sometimes there's just 1,000, moments throughout the day. But man, that's a cool book concept. I'm excited for that.
Well, yeah, and of course we will get into some of the locational things because, as Jed Burton said, when you ask why this topic of the Nephilim is relevant today, and I asked him this in an interview a few months ago, and I remembered this answer because it really encapsulates it. Why should we as Christians care about the Nephilim? Why do the giants of Genesis 6 matter to us today? And Jed said 2 words: Caesarea Philippi.
Really?
Oh, yeah, that's that area right at the base of Mount Hermon with the giant cave called Panias, or the Grotto of Pan.
Oh,
which
wow.
is exactly where Jesus asked the disciples, well, who do they say the Son of Man is? Well, some say he's Elijah, some say he's this or that, a prophet or what. And then he said, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for this man has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, a little wordplay here. You are Petros, Peter, and on this rock, this Petra, 9,200-foot mountain that we're standing right in front of, I will build my church, and the gates of hell, which is this big cave right over here that everyone knows is the entrance to the netherworld, because that's what they thought back in the day, will not prevail against it. Now, we've had the opportunity to... Now, here's the thing. When you read the Gospels in context, you understand that Jesus made a special trip to Caesarea Philippi to set up that exchange.
Yeah.
Because just prior to this, he had gone into the region of Tyre and Sidon, which are on the coast of Lebanon. And he healed the daughter of the Syro-Phoenician woman, and then he came back. Now, I had to look this up because, again, this is where a little research really opens some doors. Where were the roads in ancient Israel? Where were the Roman roads in ancient Israel? Well, it turns out there's a Roman road that runs from Tyre right past Dan and right past Caesarea Philippi, the Grotto of Pan, on the way over to Damascus. So Jesus could have said, hey, guys, while we're in the neighborhood, let's just go over here to the Grotto of Pan. I got something I want to do here. No, they turned south and they went down to the Sea of Galilee, which is 30 miles away. Now, when you're walking, that's a 2-day walk. So they went down to the Sea of Galilee, and he fed 4,000, which is 4,000 men, plus their women, their wives, and their children with like 5 loaves of bread. And he did some other healing in the vicinity of the Sea of Galilee. And then they walked back to Caesarea Philippi. It was a special trip. And Judd argues that based on the clues in the Bible, it may have been during the annual Roman festival of Lupercalia, which was a major feast in the Roman calendar. I don't know, but the point was they did it right there at the base of Mount Hermon. Yeah. And then according to the Gospels, like 8 days later, he climbed a very high mountain with Peter, James, and John. And the only very high mountain in the vicinity of Caesarea Philippi is Mount Hermon.
Wow.
Climbs this mountain that was sacred to the creator god of the Canaanites, El, who, again, in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, I argue is Enlil, Dagon, Molech, Saturn, Kronos, Shemiyaza, et cetera, was transfigured, turned into a being of light, and Elijah and Moses appear.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, do you think the spirits in the spirit realm took notice of what was happening?
Yeah. That's what we call a power move.
Yeah, there's definitely a power move.
Jesus was like, that's one of the greatest things about, people are always, the criticisms of Jesus is that he's gentle, is Jesus gentle, meek, and mild? It's like, dude, if you know what's going on and you read this in the context you're supposed to,
it's like, here I am, come get some.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's got that warrior spirit, man. It's amazing, the power moves.
Yeah.
Hey, Derek, we have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Do you mind if I put those up on the screen and you
please do.
tackle them? The first one is from Madeline Kimbrough. Let me throw this up here. What does Luke 21 mean about signs in heaven? I think this is the Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse when Christ is talking about the signs of the times. And I think she's referring to Luke 21:11, where it says, "And earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven."
That's a really good question. I don't know that I can answer that one with authority. I would suggest that we will see things in the heavens that we've not seen previously. I know Tom Horn has been writing and talking about the dream that he had, the very vivid dream of the incoming asteroid Apophis, which is scheduled to make a very near pass of Earth officially on April 13th of 2029.
Which is a Friday the 13th, by the way.
Yes, it is. And it's so close, it'll pass inside some of the orbits of our satellites around Earth. But it will come through at about the time of Passover in 2029. And so back up 3.5 years, if this is Wormwood, as Tom believes it is, and if Wormwood arrives at the midpoint of the Great Tribulation, that means October of 2025, during the Feast of Tabernacles, would be the rapture for if there is in fact a pre-tribulation rapture. So, but as far as great signs in heavens, I don't know. I think we will see things like comets and other things in the skies that we've not seen previously. I don't think we can look for. We're not looking at changes of which is the ruling house in the zodiac or anything like that.
Okay.
I do think it's interesting though, and that again, the Olivet Discourse on the Mount of Olives, given the connection between Mount Hermon and the Mount of Olives, was really significant.
Yeah, you actually go into that quite a bit in your book about the Mount of Olives and how
the symmetry.
That was like it was all about the Mount of Olives. You even argue that the Calvary was there, the resurrection, the ascension, all of those events were on the Mount of Olives, directly across from the Temple Mount.
Right.
And it has to do with establishing that authority, like you did at Hermon, on a mountain where, and correct me if I'm wrong, but altars to Molech and other gods had been built.
Right.
That's where the groves were.
Yeah, Solomon did that, and that's documented in 2 Kings, that the rabbis referred to the Mount of Olives as the Mount of Corruption because of the high places that were put up there for Astarte, who is Inanna, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, who was Ares of the Greeks, Mars of the Romans, and Milcom or Molech. Milcom, chief god of the Ammonites, and I showed, again, the scholarly, peer-reviewed, secular research documenting that Milcom of the Ammonites, Molech to the Hebrews, was El of the Canaanites, this same entity whose mount of assembly was Mount Hermon. Solomon put a high place up there in the Mount of Olives. Now, we've been blessed to go to Jerusalem, to go to Israel twice now. We're going back next March, and we, as part of the tour, of course, you go to the Mount of Olives, and there's an overlook there where you can look down and you see the Temple Mount, and you realize the Mount of Olives is a couple hundred feet higher than the Temple Mount. So, I mean, God chose as his Mount of Assembly, his, in the Hebrew, the phrase is Har Moed, which is where John got the words for Armageddon. It's been mistranslated by English speakers into thinking that it has something to do with Megiddo. It's not. It's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. You're looking down on God's mountain. The Mount of Olives is to the east. So the opening, the doors, the entry to the temple was to the east. So you open the doors of the temple and you look up in this mountain across the valley, and there's a high place to Molech up there. And the valley that runs just south of the old city of Jerusalem is the Valley of Hinnom, where they would burn children to Molech. So, it's astonishing that Solomon would do this. I mean, Solomon, when you read his story, God personally spoke to him in the temple that he just built. And before he died, he was building a temple on a higher mountain, visible from the entry to the temple of Yahweh on this mountain across the way. What blew me away was looking at the Hebrew. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar or Hebrew speaker, so I had to consult with a friend who is a native Hebrew speaker, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat. The phrase translated Mount of Corruption in 2 Kings is Har Ha-Mashkith. Well, Ha in Hebrew is the definite article the. So wait a minute, but in English we say Mount of Corruption. It's not Mount of the Corruption. So, all right, well, let's do a search. The Logos Bible software, let's do a search for that phrase in Hebrew. Is it anywhere else in the Bible? Yeah, Ha-Mashkith. Yes, it shows up in Exodus, book of Exodus chapter 12. The destroyer, the destroying angel went through Egypt, smiting the firstborn. Was the destroyer. So I asked Zev, can you translate this Ha-Mashkith as Mount of the Destroyer? And he said, well, yeah, that makes sense. It's like, yeah. Okay, so you got this entity who I believe was Shemiyaza, who is king of the Titans, Kronos, Saturn, currently in the abyss, in the netherworld, in Tartarus. And there's this entity called the Destroyer who comes out in Revelation 9, who's called king over those in the bottomless pit. It seems to me that at least the circumstantial evidence points to this being one and the same. Yeah. So the Mount of the Destroyer, the Mount of Olives, and Jesus spent the last week of his life on this earth dividing his time between the temple on the Temple Mount and teaching on the Mount of Olives.
Wow. Yeah. So that could mean potentially that Shemyaza, imprisoned in the abyss, could have been released temporarily to carry out God's judgment on Egypt.
I don't think we're looking at the same entity there. And did some reading on that because, yeah, that would be a difficult phrase that would be difficult to square, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that there are some entities that are referenced in the Old Testament. For example, in Habakkuk 3, there's a reference to plague and pestilence following God as he's marching forth from Sinai, from Timon, leading Israel to the Promised Land. And those are known entities in the Canaanite and Amorite pantheons. Pestilence is Dever, and plague is Resheph, who is better known as Apollo. Oh, really? And it would appear that they were limited to doing what God allowed them to do, sort of like dogs on leashes. But I would find it hard to believe that the destroyer of Exodus is the same entity that would be coming out of the abyss in Revelation 9.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I got what you just said. They're like two different rabbit trails I want to go down because I'd really want your opinion on something.
I know.
Oh my gosh, this is so great. Okay. First of all, the entity that did go through Egypt and kill the firstborn, isn't it interesting? You said when we were talking earlier, the firstborn were the the ones who poured out the offering on behalf of the family to the dead.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
the house gods.
Yeah, they were the firstborns were the cup bearers, and that's what
Right,
Aquarius
Is
is.
that
Obviously.
why they were?
Is that why he chose firstborn?
I'd never thought about that, but that's a really interesting connection.
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder there.
Because one of our questions, in fact, it was a very tangential one. It was our last question was, why did God choose the firstborn, to die in the last, in the plague of Egypt? And, it's, you understand, the patriarchal nature and the cultural nature of the firstborn, but just always kind of wondered, is there something behind the scenes? I wonder if it's not something like
Yeah,
that.
you need to do more
born out of
research on that,
lineage.
because the firstborn always had to be redeemed with another sacrificial animal in the temple.
Really?
But but among the Canaanites and Amorites, sacrificing that firstborn child to Baal Haman, which is just another name for Saturn, Kronos, El, Shemiyaza,
Yeah.
was a thing. I mean, the Egyptians, there's that story in Second Kings where Jehoshaphat is going to war against Mesha, the king of Moab, and Meshach sacrifices his son on the wall of his city. But they've actually found an Egyptian inscription depicting an Egyptian army besieging a Canaanite city, and the Canaanite defenders sacrificing children on the walls.
Whoa.
Jeez.
So this is this is not just a thing where the Bible, the Hebrew prophets were trying to make their neighbors look bad. This was known to the Egyptians, and the Romans and the Greeks knew this about their Phoenicians, about the Phoenicians as well. So, this was not a thing that was made up to kind of sell Judaism or Christianity to the rest of the world. This was a known practice in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Well, and it still persists to this day in so many different forms, whether it's, something political, like what we've been dealing with on the home front, or wars, I mean, we don't send our 40-year-olds off to other countries. We send our 17, 18, 19-year-olds. Right. And it's all through the occult, I mean, they made movies about it, sacrificing children for the harvest, the Molech thing has been around forever.
It's a very, very old thing. Yeah, it's sad. And it continued into the Christian era. You look at the statistics just from the last couple of years, and the number one cause of death, and I mentioned this in the book, number one cause of death worldwide the last 2 years now is abortion.
Is it really?
I believe it.
Wow.
I
guess so. Being first world nations and
the
populations, and it makes sense. And it's such a pathological, it's such a destructive, anti-God sort of.
Yeah, and if you look at it through a supernatural, viewpoint, when there's anything
to
that
sacrifice your own child,
what you're seeing going on right now, with the Supreme Court and their opinion and that changing somehow.
Yeah.
When you see one side lose their freaking minds.
Oh yeah.
How vitriolic they want.
They
have to protect it. And you're like, it's almost evil. Like there's something supernatural behind it. They're trying to protect it.
Very supernatural.
Right. You're taking away the sacrifices.
You're taking. Well, I had a friend. I have a friend who is like as like deep down the rabbit hole of weird things that you can't talk about at parties. I am from Nick. This guy is he is the Tartarus to my earth, and he made a very distinctive point, about how I love this guy. He's awesome. I can never get him on here, but he made a very distinctive point about how abortion clinics, everybody wears scrubs. It looks like a ritual. It looks very similar to what you would see in these ancient cultures. You're in a specific room. The woman lays on a table that very much seems like an altar. And there's the doctor who's the head priest. Everybody wears their scrubs and their masks, and they wore masks back then. It's like it's changed a little bit, because it's medical. But medical media, it's just whatever, there is something incredibly supernaturally sinister. And I know women who had the hardest time getting pregnant, and they could never imagine someone doing that. I was just talking to a beautiful girl last night about this, about how she had to have she was coerced into an abortion when she was younger, and it haunts her to this day.
Oh yeah.
And then I know other women who are not Christians who they're so grateful because they had an abortion, because in their own words, I would not be able to have the life I have now if it weren't for this termination that I did.
Wow.
And so the supernatural aspect is pretty prevalent. It's blatant, in that topic.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I have another question for you related to Apollo.
Good, because we bummed everybody out.
Right.
Talking about.
Talk about Debbie Downer.
Welcome to the Goslings. Get prepared to get bummed.
But before I ask my question, there was another chat question by Ann Creighton.
Crichton, yeah.
And this is interesting. It has to do with in Psalm 8, it says a man was made little lower than the angels. And the New American Standard translates it a little lower than God. What does Derek think of this?
Well, we had a really interesting discussion, Sharon and I, with Timothy Alberino a while back about his book Birthright, and he pointed out something that I thought made a lot of sense. I think it's because of the sense in the ancient world, in the sense that we still have this day, that heaven is up there, the netherworld is down there, and we occupy sort of the Middle Earth, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And we were created to have dominion over this realm, whereas the angels were created to have dominion over the spirit realm. And so I think that is maybe at the heart of this rebellion by some of these supernatural entities, because they look at this realm and see us as limited and flawed, because we can't do what they do in terms of moving between dimensions. We are not eternal, at least not in this form. The fact is, we are all eternal beings. It's just
we can't take any form we want like they can.
Yeah,
we don't.
exactly.
Yeah, we don't have the supernatural powers that they have.
The theology of the prophecy movies with Christopher Walken.
Yeah, Russell Wong.
Theology, but the way Walken portrays Gabriel, as we're just a bunch of monkeys, is probably close to the way some of these rebellious angels see us. We're just creatures of mud.
Yeah.
And yet God created us and gave us dominion over this beautiful planet.
I think that was the exact phrase that Viggo Mortensen used when he played Lucifer in those movies. Yeah.
Yeah. And that scene where he eats Gabriel's heart and then squeals with delight is like, wah.
Oh yeah, it almost makes you wonder which is creepier, that or when he's talking to Virginia Madsen. I think it's Virginia Madsen, and he eats the flower. And it's just the symbology of anyways, but it's right.
But there is a verse in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 6, if I remember right. Yes, 1 Corinthians 6:3. Do you not know that we are to judge angels?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So not only are our elder brothers, the angels, looking at us and like, Lord, why did you make them this way? And why did you give them dominion over this beautiful place?
Mm-hmm.
And then why are you creating them why are they going to have the right to judge us? I think some of the fallen realm decided that just wasn't going to happen, and they were going to take steps to try to stop that. So we've been made lower than the angels for now, but day is coming. 1 Corinthians 15, read that chapter, because it is a summary of Christian theology, the gospel by which you are being saved, in the first 3 verses of 1 Corinthians 15. Then he goes into the apologetics and how we can know that Jesus Christ was literally raised from the dead. He appeared first to Peter, and then to James, and then to the 12, and then to 500 brothers at once, some of whom have died, but most are still awake. In other words, hey, church at Corinth, don't believe me about this resurrection thing? Yeah, it's kind of unbelievable, but there are still witnesses walking around 20 years later. Send somebody to Jerusalem and ask around.
Yeah.
The rest of the chapter is why resurrection is so important, because we're going to be raised up into incorruptible bodies For we will become like them. And then Hebrews chapter 2, where Jesus introduces us to the divine council. And we're there for the most awesome concert in all of history. And there are ways of interpreting it, but Hebrews 2 cites Psalm 8. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. And then you go down to verse 12. I will tell of your name to my brothers. Think about this, the day when we are introduced to the divine council. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise.
Yeah.
Man.
Powerful.
Yes, we've been made a little lower than the angels for now.
For a little while.
We are resurrected.
Yeah.
And it's think about the parable of
it's the prodigal son.
It's
Jacob and Esau. It's these parallels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. We will be welcomed back home, even though we're covered in pig mess. And the elder brothers is like, well, we've been here faithful to you the whole time.
Yeah.
What are we? It's like, hey, look, you've got your inheritance.
Yeah.
Be glad, be joyful that he was lost and now is found.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an amazing story. Timothy helped us understand that in his book Birthright, highly recommended. But when you understand that that some of the parables that Jesus taught, we've been taught, we heard them since Sunday school, and it's okay, this means we're supposed to forgive. Yeah, but there's a much bigger story here. The parable of the wicked tenants, the tenants who are given charge of a vineyard because the owner is far away and they're not paying the rent that's due, and so they send the owner sends somebody to collect, and they beat him, and another guy comes, they beat him up, and they send a third guy and they kill him. And so the owner says, I know, I'll send my son, they'll listen to him. And so the wicked tenants say, if we kill the heir, we will inherit the vineyard. How does that make any sense? It doesn't. Well, of course they do. And Jesus asks the Pharisees and the scribes who are there, what's going to happen when the owner comes from this faraway land? Well, these guys will be destroyed. And then they perceived that Jesus was talking about them, and they got really mad. But he wasn't talking about them. He was talking about the principalities and powers behind them.
Right. Yeah. The puppet masters, the ones controlling the scenes.
Yes, that's exactly it. So there's a lot more in the Bible when you realize that this war has been ongoing since Eden and even before.
Yeah.
And we're in the middle. We're the prize in all of this, really.
Yeah. Well, that kind of takes me to a question about Apollo. In Daniel, Gabriel comes to Daniel and saying, I was trying to get to you. I was interrupted by the Prince of Persia. Yep. When I'm done giving you my message, I'm going to go off to fight the Prince of Greece. He's talking about these principalities that rule over these empires. And it makes me wonder, could Apollo potentially be the entity that is currently over the American empire?
Oh, yeah. What's the Principality of America?
That's a really good question. I would argue that it's Satan.
Really? The accuser himself.
We think that storm god, Satan, the king who has a kingdom, according to Jesus, is the one who emerged as the major power over Western civilization. That he was smart enough to perceive that with the emergence of the Greeks in the, say, 4th century BC under Alexander, and then the Roman Empire, which emerged really in the 2nd century BC, that things were moving further to the west. I think the Prince of Persia is another entity who is aligned against him. I would suggest there's a principality over Russia who is stands in opposition to this entity. Now, again, this is speculative, and I'm not going to go out and say that this is the way it is and this is how we have to orient our theology, because there's no way to know. Like Paul said, we're looking into a mirror, into a room with insufficient light.
Right.
Glass darkly.
Yeah.
But when you consider that the so-called Temple of America, the United States Capitol, this temple of democracy, Liz Cheney called it the most sacred space in our democracy. It's like, no, that would be your prayer closet, except I don't know whether she has one, but that would be it if that was it.
She's got a closet. Sorry. I'm sorry. We can cut that from the podcast.
Well,
and
I'll
editing
get
if
that. I'll
need
get that
be.
in post. I'll cut that in post.
My bad.
But when you consider that the reason it's called the Capitol, Capitol, as distinguished from Capitol with an AL, is because that's the name of the temple of Jupiter, who, remember, is just the Roman name for the storm god who Jesus identified as Satan. That's the name of his temple in Rome, the Capitolium.
I had always wondered that, and no one ever has a good explanation for that in school. By the way, when you're growing up, no one ever talks about why it's Capitol, not Capital.
Yeah.
And,
No, it's well known.
It just is, and
The architect, Pierre Charles L'Enfant and Thomas Jefferson, when they were laying out Washington, D.C. in 1799, this is setting aside all the Freemasonic symbolism built into the streets. I didn't even go into that in the book because Tom Horns covered that really well. But why is the Capitol the Capitol? That's something Tom didn't get into in Zenith 2016, Apollyon Rising 2012. Why in these letters that are preserved at the Library of Congress, Jefferson and L'Enfant went back and forth. L'Enfant wanted to call it Congress House. Okay, that makes sense. In 1799, there was not a single, no, I take it back. There was only one building on Earth where a legislative body met that was called the Capitol, and that was the state of Virginia and their legislative building in Williamsburg. But Jefferson, again, I'm not saying Thomas Jefferson was a Satanist or anything like that. I just don't think he really thought this through.
Right.
He wanted to evoke the glory of Rome.
Yeah.
In fact, if I remember correctly, the little stream that comes into the Potomac there was, they were calling it the Tiber, if I'm not mistaken, but I'd have to look that up. Anyway, he insisted that it be called the Capitol for the Temple of Jupiter in Rome.
Yeah.
And so it is. And so now we got like 38 out of the 50 states here in the Union where our legislative bodies meet in a building called the Capitol because that's the name of the Temple of Jupiter in ancient Rome, which interestingly called the Capitol because it was on the Capitoline Hill. And that was called the Capitoline Hill because on Mons Saturnus, the Mount of Saturn, in the 6th century BC, when the last king of Rome, whose name was Tarquin the Proud, was digging the foundation for what would become the Temple of Jupiter, they found a severed head.
No way.
Yeah. Now, Tarquin was an Etruscan. The Etruscans were the descendants of the survivors of the Trojan War, the Trojans who fled west. And according to their religion, severed heads was how you communicated with the dead.
Yeah.
It was considered a good omen. And so they renamed Mons Saturnus and moved the Temple of Saturn from the top of the hill down to the bottom, just like Saturn had been demoted by Jupiter and kicked down to Tartarus. They put the Capitoline, the Temple of Jupiter on top of the Capitoline Hill. I mean, in Latin, the word for head is caput, like, the capo, the boss in the mafia, the head.
Yeah.
So that's why Capitol Hill, decapitation, right. That's why in Washington, D.C., the United States Capitol is on Capitol Hill.
Wow.
It's all named for some unnamed guy who lost his head in ancient Rome 20 years ago. And because the practice back in the day was that's how you communicated with the dead. And again, our legislative body meets in a building named for the Temple of Satan.
Yeah. That communicates with the dead via severed heads.
Wow.
Welcome to your government.
Man.
And then there are texts from ancient Ugarit that refer to the Rephaim, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood, as the warriors of Baal.
The warriors. And they would try to, if I remember correctly from your book, they would try to invoke those spirits or get them to do favors for them or help them, witchcraft sort of stuff. And
Correct.
And if I remember correctly, that civilization, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that civilization, according to your book, ended 1,000 years before Sargon of Akkad. Is that the one, or was it another one?
Sargon arose around 2300 BC, 2400 BC in that time frame. I don't remember the exact year, but it was around that time. The Hurrians began building at their city of Urkesh in northern Mesopotamia around 3500 BC.
Okay.
But the Hurrians continued down into the biblical time. I mean, in the Bible, they're just called Horites.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. That's a fascinating thing about the more, archaeological stuff that occurs, the more it ties in with the Bible, the more it's validated in the biblical text, and much older than what, people, I mean, Gobekli Tepe, they couldn't cover that one up, man. That threw the curve. And that kind of changed the narrative, and the narratives kept changing since then, and it kind of dovetails back with Graham Hancock and his theory about the water erosion on the Sphinx, which is 12,500 years ago. And just eventually they're not going to be able to, it's a bowl overflowing, and they're not going to be able to keep the water in the bowl.
What's really interesting about Gobekli Tepe is there's new research that's just been published within the last year or so now that shows that there was a skull cult at Gobekli Tepe and some of the other sites around there. There's a site, there's like a collection of a dozen sites around the plains of Haran, which is where Abraham was called from, interestingly, coincidentally, I think not, called Tas Tepe, which means the stone hills. So there are a dozen sites like Gobekli Tepe, all within like 120 miles of Haran, and we're going there in October.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're taking a tour there in October. So we still have openings for people who are interested.
Skywatch. Can we go? No, I'm kidding. That's awesome.
Wow.
The Archaeology Museum in Sanliurfa is one of the places where they've collected artifacts from there and from Karahan Tepe nearby, which is even older than Gobekli Tepe. But there's another site called Kayanu, where archaeologists have excavated a site that they call the Skull Temple or the Skull Building, like 100 human skulls. And when they tested, what is this discoloration on this must be the altar here? Oh, it's human blood. Okay.
No way. Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, even Golgotha is the skull, the cap of the skull, or the crown of the skull.
And our friend Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat argues, based on his research, that as it mentions in the Old Testament, David took the head of Goliath back to Jerusalem with him. And he believes that he was buried on the Mount of Olives, hence Golgotha. It's not just place of the skull, it's a place of Goliath's skull.
Oh, wow.
Ooh, that's interesting.
That's awesome. That's okay.
It's so much. I'm just shocked to hear that everything really ties back to the Mount of Olives.
Yeah.
Because we always assumed these were different places. These were all different spots on the map.
Armageddon.
Yeah.
Megiddo.
Golgotha.
Yeah.
The traditional site of the crucifixion and tomb and. But you have connected everything to show pretty clearly that it was all the Mount of Olives, directly opposed
to
or
Mount
across.
Hermon.
Yeah, well, directly opposed from the Temple Mount, where the temple was.
Yeah,
right there, looking down on Jerusalem and God's temple. Man, that's crazy. I have a question about Apollo. I think in your book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons. We didn't know we were going to talk about two books. But you something was really, really interesting that I read of yours a couple weeks ago. You kind of conjecture that the first seal has potentially been opened already.
Oh.
And that's the first four seals of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And the first one is the rider on the white horse. And you show very well in your book that would have been understood of the first century Jew or Christian. When they read that, that's Apollo. That's Apollo. And there is a parallel. I never knew this until 2 weeks ago. Read the Bible all my life. There's a parallel prophecy. Is it in Zechariah or Ezekiel? I can't remember which. But it's the same thing. There are
four horsemen.
There are four horsemen, four chariots, four horsemen, same colors. And the one that's white goes to the west.
Oh, really?
And you conjecture that Apollo might be Western civilization, led by the U.S.
Yeah, we and again, this goes back to David W. Lowe in another book that he read that was really influential on us called Earthquake Resurrection. I highly recommend that one because that'll help clarify a lot of understanding of end times prophecy at earthquakeresurrection.com.
Okay.
He argued that the first 5 seals have been opened. And it makes sense when you read Revelation chapters 4, 5, and 6 that John is in heaven. He's taken up to the throne room of God, and there's an angel calling out, who is worthy to open the seals, and no one is found worthy, interestingly, in heaven, on the earth, or under the earth, who's worthy to open the seals, the scroll. And so John weeps, and then suddenly a lamb who was slain, that's a representation of Jesus, appears between the four guardian creatures, those are the cherubim, and the throne, and God himself. And he begins opening the seals. And okay, we know from the book of Acts that when Stephen was being stoned, he saw one like the Son of Man at the right hand of God. Okay, that's Jesus. Paul writes in the books of Ephesians, and the author of the book of Hebrews writes as well, that Jesus is already in heaven at the right hand of the Father. So we know that within the first decade or so, at least, according to the eyewitnesses there and the testimony of the apostles, that Jesus was already in heaven. So just like in Revelation 12, where John is shown the vision of the woman clothed in the sun with her feet in the moon, and she's, gives birth to a man-child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Okay, that's a view of the past, because that's the birth of Jesus. So John wasn't seeing everything in Revelation in the future. Some of these things were in the past, and we argue that this was in the past because as of 3 years after the resurrection, when Stephen was being stoned and persecuted by Paul, he said he saw Christ at the right hand of the Father.
Right. So
we argue the first horseman, the rider on the white horse, is Apollo. There are some good clues there, like he's an archer, like Apollo was. He was a plague god who spread plague with his bow and arrow. The bow, the Greek word is toxon, from which we get toxicity, and so forth. Only place in the Bible it's used, which means, as Mike Heiser says, it's weird, and if it's weird, it's important.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's so true.
Is that he's got a crown, and we think, okay, crown, we know what that is, the thing you wear on your head. What kind of a crown? The Greek word is Stephanos. It's a crown of victory. This is the crown that was given to winners in the Olympic Games.
Mm-hmm.
The crown that became the symbol of the Roman emperors who identified with Apollo.
Right.
This is to be distinguished from the diadem, which is a crown of royalty.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19, who is the Messiah, Jesus, he wears many diadems. That's different from this crown, this Stephanos. And in Greek cosmology, Apollo is the one who invented the Stephanos. He was chasing a river nymph named Daphne, who resisted his advances and prayed to her father, a river god, who changed her into a laurel tree. So to honor her, Apollo created this crown of laurel, and that became the Stephanos, the crown of victory.
Yep.
Yeah. So the second seal, the red horse, this is war. That's Ares, Mars. That was pretty easy. The fourth seal, death, Thanatos. That's what started this whole line of thinking. Sharon said, if Thanatos, who is a Greek entity known in their pantheon, who are the other three? Oh, okay. Well, let's start researching that. The rider on the black horse was a little more difficult, but when we started digging into it, we concluded that this was probably the Babylonian god Nabu, who was Hermes to the Greeks and Mercury to the Romans. Mercury is based on the same Latin word from which we get merchant and mercantile, merchandise. He's the god of commerce. That's another word based on that root, but also the god of scribes. In ancient Babylon, people were illiterate, and so they would have to go to the scribal class who worshipped Nabu to write down things like wills and letters and contracts and so forth. Nabu was the one who also tracked what was given to the temple. You kept the ledgers, in other words. And interestingly enough, back in 2009, you remember the great real estate collapse after 2008?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The good folks at MasterCard instituted a new fee that merchants have to pay every time somebody swipes a MasterCard. It's like a 2-cent charge that they have to pay. They could have called it anything. Internet.
What did they call it?
They called it the Network Access Brand Usage.
I knew it. The Nabu fee.
The MasterCard, 2 cents goes to Nabu.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. So that's where we came up with this idea that these entities were known in the first century to Greeks, Romans, Jews, Christians. They would have known who these entities were and who John was referring to. So it doesn't just symbolize war. It doesn't just symbolize economic servitude, debt servitude. It is the spirit behind it And so that we think is going on. But they're limited in what they can do until the restrainer is removed that Paul writes about to the church at Thessalonica. So for now, they can wreak havoc, but only on a limited scale. When the restrainer is removed, all hell breaks loose in a very literal sense. Yeah.
Was Nabu worshipped in Babylon?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
They found a temple to Nabu in ancient Babylon just not long ago, within the last decade or so, which was literally dedicated to Nabu of accounts.
Huh. See, I wonder, this is just like a total philosophical or ideological rabbit trail, but I wonder if there's not like a link between Babylonian usury, and then this the writing and the the administering of Nabu, and then also how that contradicts a high trust culture where your word is your bond. Because when you're writing things, if you're writing a contract down, it's because you don't trust the other party to just, speak the truth, speak the word, speak logos, put logos into the world, and so instead of doing that, you live in a low trust culture where things have to be written down, and there is a spiritually or psychologically toxic nature to that I guess might tie into the whole usury lending debt system.
Well, I'll tell you, if the world is not ruled today by lawyers, accountants, and bankers, I don't know who does run it.
Right? Yeah. No kidding. Yeah. If you want to get anything done, get the lawyer. Because the institution is not going to listen to you until you do. Okay, so we're coming up on 2 hours. What do we still have time for a couple questions, or do we need to let you go, Derek? What works best for you?
Well, like I said, it's usually about this time of the evening I check in on my 85-year-old mom. So
okay, gotcha. Awesome.
We get a couple of questions. I can take them quick, but this is a fun conversation. So
this has been so great.
Yeah.
This has been awesome. So I just wanted to ask real quick if you had any information on this. You've talked about how the Christmas star is a conflation of the aligning of Jupiter to create the Aquarian age. But in the Bible, there still was the star that led the wise men to. What do you think the actual Christmas star was? Not the one that they say it was a couple years ago.
Well, Dr. E.L. Martin wrote a book about this called The Star That Astonished the World some years back, and you can find it for free online. There was and I mentioned this in the book, I think. Sharon and I did a program on this for our Unraveling Revelation program last Christmas, I think. There were a couple of conjunctions in the year 3 BC that were probably what the wise men saw. One of them was a conjunction between Jupiter and Venus in Virgo. And Venus, of course, is the representation of Inanna, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Astarte, etc. And so the idea that this virgin was, that it was going to be giving birth to the heir to the king. Yeah. And then later that year, there was a conjunction between Jupiter and the star Regulus, which is the king star in the constellation Leo. Regulus, Rex, king. And that appears to have been on or about September 11th of 3 BC, if I remember correctly. Mike Heiser wrote about this, and that's where I heard about E.L. Martin. Now, he was part of Herbert W. Armstrong's Worldwide Church of God, which had some deviant theology, but on this, his research seems to be good. And I cite E.L. Martin actually on his research on the location of the crucifixion site, being the Mount of Olives. So some of his other stuff at his website there is really, really good. But that's probably what it was. These conjunctions that were read by the wise men from the East. And did they come all the way from what is now Persia, Iran? Don't know. It's possible they may have just been on the east side of the Jordan River, but they spotted these signs and interpreted what they meant. It was not this this conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which was put forward by Johannes Kepler, who was the famous astronomer in the 17th century, looking for a naturalistic explanation. What is it they might have seen that would have confused these primitive, simple men of centuries gone by? Yeah, just a little condescending there, Johannes.
Yeah.
These guys understood the sign and understood the prophecies of the Old Testament and knew, based on the timing of the prophecies, that they were getting near the end of that age. Boy, Ken Johnson, Josh Peck have done some really good work on the calendars of the Essenes and the understanding that the early Christians, based on the Essenes, who were some of the first Christians, had of what these signs meant. They knew they were getting near the end of the age of the patriarchs and beginning the age of grace, the 2,000 years that began with the coming of the Messiah. So I think there's a correlation there, but I've not researched it thoroughly. But again, based on the work of E.L. Martin and the star that astonished the world, the date of Jesus' birth was probably September 11th of 3 BC.
That gives me chills.
Yes, that's right.
That gives me chills.
Yeah.
Ugh.
That's why it happened on September 11th. It was another desecration.
Yep.
You know, yeah.
Golly.
Yeah. For the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. That's the thing, man. You know, they want you to think that the stars and the planets rule you, but no, the stars are simply signs of things that the Lord has control over.
Yes, sir.
I know. Yeah.
Yep.
Dude,
that's awesome.
this has been so much fun.
Man, Derek,
Thank
you have
so much
you have
for your time.
really been an awesome guest, and
Nick's mom is in the chat. She's watching.
Yep,
She's
my
super
mom-
excited. She's
yep.
a mega fan.
Yep, absolutely. I've been talking to her about this for weeks. We've been so excited.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time and being so generous too. 2 hours is, I mean, that's just fantastic. Thank you for that. And we'll let you go.
Yeah.
So you can
Call your mom
and enjoy your family on Memorial Day weekend. And man, we would love at some point in the future to do this again, because we have even more questions. And you have lots of books that we still need to read.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
well, likewise. And one of these days, I have to get you on to my podcast, A View from the Bunker, to talk about how you're trying to reach out through your writing to audiences. I mean, we're all shooting at, different targets here, aiming at different targets, and just using the gifts with which we've been blessed. So we'd love to do that. So I'll be in touch about that.
That sounds great. We'd love that, man. That'd be fantastic.
Derek Gilbert, author of The Second Coming of Saturn, amongst many other books. Derek, real quick, website, where's the best place for people to find you?
Well, gilberthouse.org is the site where Sharon and I sort of have everything. Gilberthouse.org. We do our weekly Bible study there and put that up as a podcast. But we just, within the last few weeks, have launched a more, concerted effort to be organized. Gilberthouse.org, and from there you can get our mobile app, which includes all of our content, which is the weekly Bible study, our weekly video program Unraveling Revelation, our weekly program Sci Friday, and my weekly podcast, A View from the Bunker. All of that on the app, and we've also got a Roku channel and Apple TV, and you can find those links at gilberthouse.org as well.
You are everywhere, man.
I know.
You are
so
everywhere.
Awesome. Such a power couple.
Awesome.
You guys are the greatest.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Derek. This has been a treat, man. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, God bless. Thank you again, and we look forward to talking again soon.
You bet.
All right. Bye.